This is Molly Hemingway, encouraging you to listen to my favorite podcast, Issues, Etc. Every day you get in-depth interviews with host Todd Wilkin asking expert guests substantive, thought-provoking questions on all of the important news and issues of our day. The expert guests are in culture, law, ethics, philosophy, theology, and apologetics. Expert guests, expansive topics, always extolling Christ. Issues, etc.
There are people who languish for years, and I'm not exaggerating, for years waiting for an organ donation, waiting to have a transplant of a vital organ in their body. And then what they face after that is obviously a lifetime of being on very powerful drugs, anti-rejection drugs, and sometimes a very diminished health, even after the organ has been replaced. There are people who are desperate. Well, it turns out China is taking advantage of that desperation, making a lot of money, and in the process, not only dehumanizing part of its population, but also exploiting the West's desire for, well, a quick and easy way of getting an organ transplant. They have their own industry, after all. Welcome back to Issues, Etc. Joining us to talk about China's organ harvesting industry, Jekielek. He's senior editor of the Epoch Times and author of the new book, Killed to Order. Jan, welcome.
So good to be here.
What is the so-called China option?
The China option is what I call killed to order forced organ harvesting from a prisoner of conscience to get an organ transplant.
Jan, you have a personal interest in this story because you follow the Falun Gong discipline. Why do you call this a new kind of evil?
So we hear about various types of cartels that run black market organ operations, and that happens and it's horrible. But what the Chinese Communist Party has organized in China is a whole different level. And let me explain it. There's a few pieces I'd like to give and support here so you understand how this works. Now, let's say you need a new heart in an ethical country where there's an ethical transplantation system. There has to be a catastrophic accident, usually a car accident or a motorcycle accident to get that heart. And there still has to be circulation in the body. So it has to be a specific kind of accident because our organs degrade very quickly when the blood circulation stops. And on top of that, there has to be an ethics team that looks at this situation and decides this person really isn't coming back. It has to be an accident that is pretty extreme, but there's still circulation in the body. And on top of that, there actually has to be matching of blood and tissue type because our bodies reject foreign objects, including organs. And then also size has to match. My point here is that it's very rare to get a donor. And that's why people wait months or years sometimes to get that organ. And there's a whole field of people waiting for one donor that just appears because of that catastrophic accident. And an algorithm is used to decide who gets to the front of the line. In China, it's the exact reverse situation. And let me give you a few pieces of the puzzle to explain how it works. Number one, they have this long history in communist China of basically creating what are called class enemies. They call it black classes. And this started with landowners back in 1949 when the revolution happened. They don't believe in private property. And there were all these people that had become significant landowners. They needed to take that land from them. They said, we're taking it for the good of the people, of course, but really they were taking it for themselves, for their own use. But to do that, the people aren't going to easily give that land, and also they have friends who might not be happy. So the way they deal with this problem is they push mass dehumanizing propaganda through their various media organs, and they take control of all the media forms of information dissemination in the country. That's every communist system does that. And so this is language straight out of the 1930s in Germany against the Jewish people, that these people are dangerous, that they've done harm to you, that maybe they took that land from you, you deserve it. You should hold these people in contempt. They're lower than you. And this kind of activates a quirk in our psychology where we become conditioned to accept terrible things being done to people, basically. And many totalitarian regimes have used this trick, so to speak. It's a very important piece of the puzzle to know that this happens. In 1999, the Chinese Communist Party created its newest black class. Okay, these were Falun Gong practitioners. This was an ancient type of Chinese yoga, a type of Qigong. On the one hand, there were these slow motion exercises that look a bit like Tai Chi and also meditation in lotus position. On the other hand, there were also these core principles, truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance. And people that did this practice took that very seriously. It was a combination of mind, body, and spirit for cultivating those things. It's a very unusual system, and this is also important to explain how this kill to order forced organ harvesting works. It's not structured as most organizations that we're familiar with. For example, there's no collection of funds. You can't enrich yourself from it. There's a lot of teachings by a man named Li Hongzhi, but there's no worships of this person. That's not allowed. There's no hierarchy in it. There's no leaders, right? There's no roster. You don't join anything. Living the teachings is actually being a Falun Gong practitioner. So it's very unstructured. And at the same time, the people that do it are very serious about doing it. And this basically grew in the 90s to 70 to 100 million people. 1 in 12 or 1 in 13 Chinese were actually doing this practice. And the regime, for a whole lot of reasons we could discuss if you want, decided to crush it, decided this is going to be the new black class. We're going to get rid of it. Now, what does it mean when someone becomes a black class? There is a way out. You can actually confess your sins against the regime. Okay, so with the landowners, you could say, land is evil, you're right. Thank you, O great Communist Party, for emancipating me from this land and from this idea that I should have land. And if you go through all this performative or even in some cases, actual change in mind, your re-education, you might be able to go home. You might survive it. If not, well, anything goes. Well, with the Falun Gong, the regime didn't realize how serious people were about this practice. And when they basically black classed them and told these people to confess that they're evil people, that they're doing bad things, that they're against the party, they just wouldn't do it. And so they incarcerated a huge number of them, maybe 1 million. We don't know the exact number. It's a state secret. But we do know the State Department said in 2005 that half the people in China's re-education through labor camp system were Falun Gong practitioners. And massive system even beyond that as well. So here's the setup. You have this large, dehumanized population that's also now incarcerated. And now what they did was they started blood typing, tissue typing, and organ scanning these people in prison ahead of time en masse. Okay, and this is why I say it's the exact reverse situation, because you have this one, let's say I'm a wealthy guy looking for an organ with very flexible morals. Okay, and I come into China, I've heard about that I can get an organ quickly. I pay my 100 or 200 grand. I can get a new heart in 2 weeks. This is what actual whistleblowers revealed to us back in the day. How can I get that? Because the donor is an innocent prisoner of conscience, and there's a whole field of them. And because there's so many, that one person is perfect match already exists in the database, and that person can be shipped and killed to order so that I can live. So it's the exact reverse of what it looks like in an ethical situation. And I think it's a crime against humanity.
Tell us about your own initial skepticism toward the early rumors of forced organ harvesting there in China.
Well, it's kind of unbelievable, right? When you think about it. There's a film called Coma when I was growing up. I don't know if you remember that, but it was this film where they were using various types of gases. People would come into a hospital to get an operation, but if someone could be a convenient donor, they would basically put them in a coma permanently. And then they had this room where they hung people, ready to become these organ donors while their bodies stayed perfused. And I remember I had nightmares about this as a kid. But again, it was so science fiction and so extreme. When I first heard about this, I thought about that film Coma. And then actually, I think it was in 2005, there was another film that came out called The Island. It was Ewan McGregor, Scarlett Johansson. There were these clones that were living in this. They didn't know they were clones, but they were basically existing to be these unwilling organ donors for their recipients. So there's this kind of thing in the science fiction field, if you will. But when I wanted to believe, I realized I wanted to believe that these rumors that I heard that this was happening at scale. By the way, I'll just add, we did know that this happened. One-offs of this did happen. There was actually a hearing, I think, back in '98 about a younger military officer being used as a donor for a senior military officer, things like this. So we knew that they were interested in this kind of stuff. But the idea that it could be done at scale was just kind of beyond what I think most people were ready to imagine, and certainly what I was ready to imagine. In 2006, I got what I call being hit over the head with the evidence. And so it was basically two whistleblowers near simultaneously come forth independent of each other. One of them was a woman who was at this hospital in Sujeatun. Her husband confessed to her, she was a surgeon, that he had removed the corneas out of 2,000 living people and that there was a camp of sorts of these Falun Gong practitioners that was being used for this. And this was one of these stories where she had detailed, verifiable information. The second whistleblower was an Israeli transplant surgeon named Jacob Levy, actually former head of the Israeli Transplant Association. And he had a patient who had a really bad heart condition. And the guy told him one day, "I'm tired of waiting. I'm going to China. They've organized it for me in 2 weeks." And Jacob couldn't believe it. He just said, "That's impossible." Why? Well, here are the red flags, right? Number one, you're scheduling a heart transplant, right? That means, in an ethical system, as I said, there has to be a catastrophic accident. You can't schedule that. That person is suddenly ready to be a donor, and you rush the person who's going to be the recipient to that moment. It happens by chance. But here, scheduled means you're killing someone. The other part is the 2 weeks. How is the 2 weeks possible? And I didn't imagine, right, that you could have an organ bank of living people because they've been black classed, because they've been deemed enemies of the state. And so we only kind of pieced this together really in 2006 from these two independent whistleblowers, and then a whole lot of amazing research that was done by, I would say less than 2 handfuls of people over the years.
How has it been investigated, this Chinese organ harvesting industry, if it's been investigated at all?
Well, a whole lot of ways. And in fact, if you want to kind of get a summary, by 2020, there was a whole lot of work that had been done. And this China tribunal was formed by a man named Sir Jeffrey Nice, who was at one point the prosecutor of Slobodan Milosevic. And he got tapped to do this. He brought together, I believe it was 8 experts. And then they got testimonies from all sorts of people that had done research, journalists and so forth. And they basically put together all of the evidence into a large report, which you can find on chinatribunal.com. So I'm just mentioning that because there's a lot more that has been done that I can possibly mention right now. But I'll mention a few things. Very early on, phone calls were made. Phone calls were made that were basically to hospitals saying, "Hey, can I get organs? How quickly? Can I get Falun Gong organs?" All these types of questions. The answers were yes, we can get them quickly. Yes, we have lots of Falun Gong. By the way, the Falun Gong were known to be particularly healthy. That's why that was kind of a reasonable question to be asked. Okay. So, well, quote unquote reasonable. But astonishingly, people readily talked about it on the phone. Now, once that research had been done, they could never get answers like that because word got around that people are calling. Another example was there were actually ads online that showed the price list for organs, said it was in 2 weeks you can get that new organ. And again, once we reported on those started disappearing. Luckily, we have some of those archived. Some other examples. There was a South Korean film crew that actually went undercover with these hidden cameras to try to procure organs in China. Very gutsy, but there's a lot of that transplant tourism is from South Korea. Not only the transplant tourism is from all sorts of countries we've seen. By the way, they also found that they could procure organs quickly and found schematics for crazy machines to facilitate it and so forth. But there's even a book. In 2009, there was a book written called Larry's Kidney. You can look it up. It's the story of a guy, his cousin went with him, who was the book author, who got an illicit kidney from China. And it's clear from the way the book is written that they knew, well, they were told that it was a death row prisoner, I believe, but they kind of felt like it was possibly not. And this book was well reviewed, and it's an astonishing piece of evidence that exists just published. And then more recently, there was a paper in the American Journal of Transplantation where the researchers, they knew that this kill-to-order forced organ harvesting is the norm in China. In fact, it's hard to imagine how there would be other forms because the incentives are set up in such a way that once you have this sort of humming forced organ harvesting system that's doing, let's say 60 to 90,000 transplants a year, it's much more complicated to do this ethical sourcing with where you get a random chance donor. But what they did was they asked the question, is it possible that because it's so standard in China to do forced organ harvesting in this kill-to-order way, maybe they've actually written it into their scientific methods, in their papers, in their publicly available scientific methods in the papers they've published. And that's what they did. They looked at over 2,000 papers, and they found at least 71 instances with very stringent criteria, by the way. We're talking about, I think it's probably a lot more papers that would qualify, but they said at least 71 papers, the dead donor rule was violated. It was very clear that the method that someone died in these studies was their organs being removed. So it's so normalized there that they even write it into their publicly available peer-reviewed scientific methods without realizing that it's a problem. This is just a sampling. There's a whole suite of evidence, as I said, that by the evidence up to 2020 is contained in that China Tribunal report. You can check it out. And there's been other work done since then.
We will talk about the ideological roots of these atrocities in the Chinese Communist Party in our two-part series on China's organ harvesting industry with Jan Jekielek.
The church's music from the 20th century. The 17th century. The 11th century. The 8th century. The 4th century. The best of the church's music from the past 2,000 years. LutheranPublicRadio.org.
Contending for truth in an age of anti-truth. You're listening to Issues, Etc.
This is Pastor Matthew Harrison, President of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. The LCMS operates the second largest parochial school system in the United States. What can you expect from a Lutheran Church Missouri Synod school? There's one race, the human race. And Jesus died for the sins of every man, woman, and child from every land and every nation. Life begins at conception. All life is precious from womb to tomb, and every student, parent, and teacher is created in the very image of God. There's right and wrong, and we know which is which from the Ten Commandments. There are only two sexes, Male and female, he created them. Marriage is the lifelong union of one man and one woman. There's such a thing as objective, absolute truth, and it's found in the person and work of Jesus Christ and His Word. To find a Lutheran Church Missouri Synod school near you, visit lcms.org/schools.
We're talking about China's organ harvesting industry. Jekielek is our guest, author of the new book, Killed to Order. I'm Todd Wilkin. This is Issues, Etc. So what are the ideological roots of these atrocities in the Chinese Communist Party?
That's a great question. Well, for starters, the Chinese Communist Party is a Marxist-Leninist regime. And you can see that it's actually more overtly that way in the last decade. It's been growing more publicly, overtly that way in the last decade under Xi Jinping, who's some of us hoped that he might actually be a reformer that would take the country in a different way. But no, he's taken it. The Marxist and Leninist roots have always been there, and it's always been clear that it's, to us at least, and to me, that it's been a regime of this nature. But Xi Jinping has been sort of like officially codifying that in his own writings and thoughts on how communist China should work. So what does that mean exactly? Well, one of the things it means is that, there's no private property, right? That's a feature of communism. Another thing, a feature of Leninism, the Communist Party is the driver of, let's call it, society and social change. So what happens in a Leninist regime is that the number one most important thing in that society is the survival and supremacy of the Communist Party, in this case, the Chinese Communist Party. And that, because it's an atheist regime, because it believes itself to be the arbiter of truth. You see, in communist regimes, they don't really believe in objective truth. They believe truth is a political construct. In other words, it's a creation of the people in charge, of the people that rule, in this case, of course, and that has to be the Communist Party. So the Communist Party in the mind of the Leninist regime is the wellspring of all truth, the wellspring of all goodness. It can never be wrong, okay? And because it's atheist, it also views human beings, and frankly, everything, not just human beings, but everything in this very extreme, instrumentalized fashion, that innate dignity of the human being, of the individual that you see, pre-Christianity in the Hippocratic view of the human being. And then, of course, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, that we're made in the image of God. And that gives us, as is codified in the Declaration of Independence, inalienable rights. All of that is completely absent to the mentality of the Chinese Communist Party and the communist society and system. Basically, they think of society as a tool, again, to the betterment of that greatest good, which is the survival and supremacy of the Communist Party. And so a big chunk of Killed to Order of my book, by the way, that's at killedtoorder.com if you're getting interested in it. That's the US Amazon link, a short link to it. Basically, you have this situation where human beings can be used much like you would use an inanimate object or a material or some element to be extracted or something like that. And so I argue in Killed to Order at some length that this type of forced organ harvesting is basically a logical conclusion of the mentality, just that the technology didn't exist to use people in this way before. And one of the biggest challenges that we have is grasping that this is real, because most of us, it's a very monstrous way of viewing the human being. Psychopaths view people this way, but most of us don't. And it's almost hard to imagine that you would have a whole society that, of course, not everybody, and by the way, in Communist China views people this way, but they are highly incentivized to, and the regime demands it. So, and of course, there's people that resist that because they're human beings and they value these core things. So to summarize, it's critical to understand that whatever the economic reality, and I would argue that the economic reality in China is not very good at the moment, whatever the economic reality, whatever amount of, to be rich is glorious, Deng Xiaoping kind of allowed the Chinese people to make some modicum of money as they were trying to kind of save the party from collapse when he came into power. The political structure is very much Marxist-Leninist and is deeply committed to being that way.
How do you explain the Chinese obsession, or at least with its leaders, with longevity?
Well, isn't that something that humanity in general has been obsessed with for a long time? I think so. I mean, there's a lot of ancient parables and stories. It's in the Bible, people hoping to live longer, and it's in the collective consciousness of humanity, people sacrificing things, right, for that longevity, for that. And you can see it even in our current society, right? There's this belief that, well, there's a huge amounts of money are being invested in trying to achieve that longevity. So that's no different in China. And I think, as we've become a more secular society, and of course, communist societies are extreme versions of secular societies, you don't have this sense that you're going to a better place. Of course, if you've lived a good moral life, all there is this. All there is the material world. When you die, that's it. Game over. So, I think for anyone who believes that, I imagine there's a push to extend that life as long as possible. Now, in communist China, it is a whole different level again, because one, if you're in that top leadership of the party, you imagine yourself to be unusually important. And of course, and you're also endowed with unusual power and wealth that, frankly, most of us can't, even very affluent people in the West can't even really imagine, because it's just that the wealth is highly concentrated among these people that are at the top of the regime. And again, they're atheists, so they don't believe that there's going to be an accountability and that this is all there is. So what they did at one point is they created an elite longevity project. They call it Project 981. It's kind of funny that there's all these things named after numbers in China. That's one of them. And, by their own estimations, which, by the way, you can't put a lot of stock in Chinese Communist Party statistics, because they have a political utility first and then a reality utility second, if you will. But they say that people that are part of this elite longevity project, which are Chinese super elites, live 16 years longer than the average life expectancy. So 72 versus 88, I think that is a statistic from 2009. I don't believe that number necessarily, but directionally it's correct. And we have noticed that Chinese super elites are definitely living a lot longer than expected. And some of them, like Jiang Zemin, who was actually the guy that started the Falun Gong persecution back in 1999, we had good evidence that he was basically dead a number of times. Like, he had these horrible strokes and heart attacks, but somehow he would always make it through, looking kind of more and more waxy afterwards. And initially, I didn't even fully realize why that might be, but that look is actually a function of these organ rejection drugs, anti-rejection drugs, for an organ to allow to stay in a body that it wasn't originally from. So you can imagine, right? You have an atheist regime that has absolute power, that believes itself to be the wellspring of all goodness and truth and so forth. So the people that are in charge of that, of course, they have first access to this particular system. And the crazy thing is, I don't know if you remember, but back in September, there was this, people call it the hot mic moment. Okay. And there was basically Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, and Kim Jong-un, three, I guess Putin isn't technically a communist dictator, but he certainly active from that time. Three dictators basically chatting, watching military parade in Tiananmen Square. And the conversation went something like this. This is a bit of a paraphrase on my part, okay? Xi says to Putin, when we're 70, we're just babies. Putin responds, through continual organ transplantation, perhaps we can achieve immortality. And Xi responds, our target is 150 years. First of all, people were calling me like crazy about this because they knew I'm interested in this topic of forced organ harvesting in China. But I had this aha moment because the light bulb went off, and it's kind of embarrassing in a way because, see, I'd known that there's this elite longevity project, Project 981, and I've known that there's this forced organ harvesting industry, large scale, but I didn't realize until that moment that this forced organ harvesting regime was the centerpiece of the elite longevity project. So yes, I can go if I need a new heart and have the very, very loose morals for 100 or 200 grand, I can get that new heart in 2 weeks. But if I'm a Chinese super elite, I have unlimited on-demand organs available to me in perpetuity. We estimate it's about a $9 billion annual industry. But what is it worth to have that, to have this kind of unlimited organs available? I asked this question and the person responded. They were like, well, that would be everything, wouldn't it? That would be beyond money. And I don't know. I think it would be worth more than $9 billion, though.
Jan Jekielek is senior editor of the Epoch Times and author of the new book, Killed to Order. We'll talk with him tomorrow about how the West has been complicit in these crimes, the Kissinger Doctrine, and the Block Organ Transplant Purchases from China Act. I'm Todd Wilken. Thanks for listening.
Listen weekday afternoons to Pastor Todd Wilken and guests on Issues Etc. Issues Etc. is a listener-supported program. Your financial support is vital for the continuation and expansion of this worldwide outreach. Our mailing address, Issues Etc., P.O. Box 83, Collinsville, Illinois, 62234. Box 83, Collinsville, Illinois, 62234. You can also donate at our website, issuesetc.org. Issues Etc. is a production of LPR, Lutheran Public Radio.
Here's an easy way for you to help us contend for truth in an age of anti-truth. Subscribe to the Issues Etc. podcast with YouTube, Spotify, and Apple. Just type Issues Etc. in the YouTube search engine and click subscribe. For Apple and Spotify, type Issues Etc. in the search engine, hit follow, and leave us a 5-star review. Help us inform other podcast listeners by subscribing to the Issues Etc. podcast with YouTube, Spotify, and Apple.
Trinity Orchard Farm is settled between two rivers showing the way to the water of life. For worship that is reverent, relevant, and refreshing like pure water, or for excellent education in a unique setting, check out our church and school. We're just 5 miles north of Highway 370 on Highway 94 in St. Charles County. Visit us on the web at trinityorchardfarm.com. That's trinityorchardfarm.com. Our phone number is 636-250-3350.